I'm hitting record, yeah. So Moore Square students are ready. So please behave like you are ready. And Grace, go ahead and start whenever you want.
You guys introduce
So my name is Kurt Selly. I'm currently working on getting a PhD at NC State University in the genetics program. And before that, I got a master's degree in food science. And before that, I got a bachelor's degree in microbiology. So I don't know what I want to be when I grow up yet. But either way, I'm really glad to be part of this discussion. I'm very grateful for your teacher to put this together. Like when I was an 8th grader, just to give you an idea of how old I am, we had no way of video conferencing with other schools or anything like this. And I had no idea what a GMO was either. So the teacher's awesome. These questions are awesome. I'm excited to be here.
My name is Jeff Himes. I'm in grad school for my master's degree at NC State, and I graduated with my bachelor's degree in chemistry from UNC. And I'm in the food science program at NC State now, and I'm excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Jenny Gredler. I am currently in a master's program at Duke University, so I work in a genetics evolutionary biology lab. I am a former NC State student, so I actually graduated here with a degree in education and biology, and so it's good to be back. And yeah.
Our first question is, how do we genetically modify food and how long does it take?
So this is a kind of a complicated question. So in terms of how we genetically modify food, well, generally that takes some steps in the laboratory. So design of new genetic sequences, right, or manipulation of genetic sequences. And then what you have to do is then you have to be able to get that DNA into the organism that you want to change. So that also takes a few steps. And then from there you have to make sure that the change you wanted to introduce is actually present in the cell. Or in the organism, the plant, or whatever it is. So that would generally take probably, the best you can do it is within a few months' time, but in terms of developing fully to a product that would be ready for commercial use, probably several years in terms of the amount of testing that we do.
Yeah, so a lot of times when you're trying to genetically modify a food, the first thing you have to do is you have to do a lot of research to figure out what gene is responsible for what you actually want to modify. So a lot of plants and foods that we have now, they're like modifying to be drought resistant, so that if there's places that experience lots of drought, they can live longer, face that, lots of herbicide resistant, insecticide resistant, things like that. So a lot of the initial steps to modifying a plant involves actually identifying what genes will actually give the plant that property that you want to modify. So that takes quite a few years and a lot of work to be able to do that initially. And then a lot of times when you want to actually take that gene that you're interested in and put it in your plant, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Plants, we know they have a cell wall, right? And it's really hard to penetrate that cell wall when you want to try to get stuff into the cell.
Hey Jenny, can you speak a little louder please?
Yeah. So a lot of times what we do is we take and we call it gene gun. Pretty cool term, right? So what we actually do is we take these metal particles, sometimes mostly gold, and you actually attach the DNA to that gold particle, and then you shoot it into the plant cell, and then in the nucleus that DNA will be taken up by the plant. So that's one way a lot of people do it. You can also just directly inject it into the cell. And a lot of times if you want to modify an actual animal, you have to do that when they're an egg still. So you can inject DNA when they're an egg. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. We have a lot of new technologies now. So we actually have instruments where we can get genome sequences really quickly. So we have a lot of new technologies where we can actually design these proteins to help us cut your DNA in your body at precise locations and actually insert genes where we want them to go. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually do this. But yeah, it takes a really long time, especially if you want to get it approved, because once you get that gene in the organism, you have to make sure, one, that it actually works like you want it to, and that it's actually safe. So it involves a lot of testing. So it takes a long time to get it to where you can actually buy it.
That's a really good point. So first, in order to change the system, you have to figure out the rules of the system, right? So you can't win at, football if you don't know the rules of football, in other words. So it's the same thing with biological systems. So you have to figure out how they do things normally, so that you can actually introduce a change in a way that would be accepted and tolerated. So
observing the desired trait being added onto the organism. But beyond that, there's not really a way to tell unless you sequence the DNA of the organism and look at like the code that makes the organism what it is.
Right. So if you're talking about like if at the grocery store, say, like if you could be able to tell if the food that you're buying is genetically modified or not, probably not. Like there's no way to really look at per se a rice grain and say, does this have that gene for drought resistant in it? No, you can't really do that. But per se, if you are out in a field where the rice is actually being grown before it's harvested, say if you are looking to see if this rice has some type of herbicide resistance, obviously if you wanted to, you can spray an herbicide on it and see if it lives or dies and tell that way. So it's a lot easier to tell if a food's genetically modified if it's actually planted in the field before it's actually harvested. But in terms of if you want to tell if the food on your plate is genetically modified, that's really, really hard to do and you can't really tell the difference.
What genetically modified foods do you know?
So one of them, I heard, does anybody know of any GMO foods?
Corn.
Corn.
Corn is huge.
Yes, that's one of the big three, I would say. Rice. Yes, there is one version of rice that's genetically modified. Any other guesses? Strawberries? I haven't heard too much about strawberries. Oh, well. Couple more. Wheat. Wheat was genetically bred, but there's not so much in terms of genetic engineering. Yes?
Tomatoes?
Yes.
Apples.
Apples? I haven't heard too much about apples recently. Chicken? Definitely not. So no animals in the U.S. are being genetically engineered. So that's actually one of the questions on here, so you just helped answer that question already. So those are all great guesses. Corn, soy, and cottonseed are some of the biggest that are genetically modified. There's a version of rice called golden rice that's genetically modified.
So we have tomatoes. There's actually a couple of potato strains that have been genetically modified, but they're not quite as prominent as, say, like the soy, corn, and cotton. There's a couple of strains of alfalfa that have been modified as well. But strikingly, wheat is still, like he had mentioned, is still largely untouched for genetic engineering, which you would think of if you eat a lot of breads and pasta and stuff like that that uses wheat, you would think that wheat would be a crop that we'd actually want to genetically engineer, right? But there actually isn't any commercially available genetically engineered wheat, so that's pretty cool.
Are there certain foods that we do not
This kind of goes back to what I was talking about with learning the rules of a particular system, right? So certain foods, we may not necessarily have the genetic technologies in place to be able to introduce genetic changes in a way that's safe, reliable, or predictable. So that is definitely true, and I'm not sure, I don't have those off the top of my head. But in general, there are a lot of foods that we simply choose not to genetically modify. So like I said, animals before is one particular subset of organisms that we can't genetically modify, but we choose not to.
Yeah, he makes a good point. So whenever you're thinking about genetically manipulating animal, it takes a lot of time to understand how their genes work. So in terms of more complex organisms like animals, we can genetically modify them, but sometimes we may not know all of the information we need to know to be able to do that. So it takes a lot of research and development beforehand to really fully understand the genomes of all the organisms you want to manipulate before you can actually do that. So a lot of times it involves, one, maybe a lack of technology. Maybe we just don't understand that organism enough to be able to manipulate their genome. Or two, there's a lot of ethical problems that surround if we were to genetically manipulate that animal. So there's a lot of public criticism and ethical issues that also stand behind it as well that will prevent people from actually genetically modifying organisms for food.
What was the first food you genetically modified?
So I have an answer for that one. The first whole food that was genetically modified was actually tomato. So it was called the Flavor Saver tomato that came out sometime in the 90s. And the original goal was to make a tomato that preserved its flavor longer drought sitting on the shelf. And actually it was a failure. It didn't work very well and it didn't sell very well, and so it's no longer on the shelves. That was the first particular food product that was genetically engineered.
What possible reasons would people want to genetically modify food?
Well, there's a lot of reasons you'd want to genetically modify food. You could, as you mentioned, you can modify something to make it drought resistant. You can modify to make it have different health characteristics. So some rice has been modified in the past to have more nutrients, to confer a greater health benefit to the consumer. You could modify foods to be different colors. Pretty much any trait that a food could have, you could take that trait and you could try to assign it to a new food.
Flavor was another one that I had mentioned. So if you want to preserve, if you want to make a strawberry that has a really great strawberry flavor, that would be another reason that you want to modify. So a lot of what's been done is resistance to various stressful conditions. So creating foods, or in this case plants, that need less water, that need less fertilizer, that need less pesticide applied to it. So all of these things are hoping to make these plants more robust in terms of growth in different conditions, and to save really, in this case, the amount of chemicals that would have to be applied. So that's one kind of common misunderstanding. Most people think that the more GMO something is, the more chemicals you have to apply to it. Well, sometimes actually the opposite is true.
Yeah, so kind of leading off of what Kurt said, so there's a huge problem that you guys might have probably talked about before in maybe your social studies class, that our human population is growing really, really rapidly. And so with that, we need to build a lot more places to live, which kind of lessens the amount of land that we actually have to grow crops. And so when you think about a population that's expanding, you actually need more crops to be able to feed everybody. So in this case, what a lot of the purpose of a lot of GMOs is to help make sure that the crops, the limited space that we do have for crops, we get the most crops out of that space. And so what that means is trying to figure out ways to make those crops grow better and actually survive. And the face of, we have a lot of climate change going on right now. So we see temperatures changing, we see a lot more flooding or droughts and things like that. So what we really want to do is to help farmers be able to create and increase their yields to, one, be able to supply the food for our growing population, and also be able to, just in order to just create that amount of food that we would need. So things like, yeah, you had mentioned, if there's an area that has a lot of flooding, to be able to create strains of wheat or of soy or cotton and things like that, that would be able to survive with more water and things like that. So in overall, most of the GMOs you see is to help increase their survival and maximize their production to feed our population.
What kind of research is being done to determine the impact of GMOs on individuals?
That's a good one.
So that kind of work is being done in field trials, like she had mentioned. So actually being able to go out and plant.
Excuse me, can you raise your volume just a little bit? We got some chaos. Thank you.
So one of the things, obviously, that's going to be important when you look at putting a genetically modified plant out into the environment is whether or not that can survive on its own, and whether or not it can transfer some of its genetic variations to the surrounding plants around it. And so there's research going on with that in terms of field trials, and a lot of that is actually being conducted by the kind of companies that are producing this, but also by other agricultural research institutions in various countries, including France, one of the big ones.
So in addition to like just them in terms of them being able to actually survive in the wild, and there's been a lot of other research. So there's also been a lot of economic studies going on with GMOs as well. So seeing in a lot of studies where looking at the increase in revenue from farm based on GMOs, so increased product yield, a lot of things like that that have to do with the economy. There's been a lot of studies that are looking at, so whenever you put a genetically modified plant out into the wild, we know they reproduce through pollen, right? So whenever their pollen can actually travel to other plants that are out in the wild as well. And so we actually have seen some strains of super resistant weeds that are also starting to grow because of it. So there's been a lot of studies looking at how pollination of nearby plants from genetically modified fields also impact other plants and leading to those resistant genes as well. There's been a lot of controversy as well with people who don't want to eat genetically modified foods because they think it could somehow harm their bodies, right? Because it's an unnatural. There's this overall view that GMOs are unnatural, and that anything unnatural is probably unsafe. And that's not entirely true. So there's been a lot of studies that are looking at how when you eat genetically modified foods, how does it actually go through your digestive tract and does it stay in your body? And so, whenever you eat foods, your stomach will break it down, right? So just like your carbohydrates and proteins that you eat, the DNA that you eat as well, it will also get broken down into its nucleic acid, so its original, just really simple subunit form, which will be taken up by your body and used. So there's been studies looking at, of course, there's some DNA that doesn't get degraded by your body, but there has been absolutely no evidence showing any type of incorporation or uptake and expression of those resistant genes, either in the bacteria in your gut or in your body. So there's a lot of studies that are going on as well as to how when you physically eat genetically modified organisms, what are the impacts, say, on your organs, does it stay around, and other things like that. So there's a lot of research that's going on to really help kind of prove that it's safe.
I think one of the major things that they're looking to do in order to, when they research what the impacts of GMOs are on the ecosystem, is determine how to physically contain that DNA or the spread. So either physically, temporally, there's any number of strategies that you could potentially do it, as well as the design. You can genetically design things such that when they get out in the environment, that they are not able actually to spread to other things. So some of that research is very new. Some of it is not out there in commercial application, so it's not being used yet. The primary way that they've tried to limit the spread of GMO DNA into the wild is by physically separating those crops from weeds and things like this.
Good. Yeah. And the reason why is I recently saw Interstellar by Christopher Nolan. We don't want to bring Hollywood into reality, but it does propose an interesting hypothesis, which is what happens when the largest breathing organism on the Earth could possibly reject GMOs and reject itself, being that GMOs being genetically modified by using I guess splicing is that one technique being used. Could you not compare that to inside the body a virus that is programmed that once it starts going out and it finds host cells, it just starts corrupting them like a program that can't be terminated? Because from what I just heard, you have there was one problem with the weeds, right? That spread. And so, what happens when GMOs possibly go wrong?
So with that particular weed situation, so that would only confer survival from a fitness perspective
Can you
if
raise
you're
your
applying the
volume?
pressure of those particular pesticides or whatever. So those herbicide-tolerant plants, the weeds that exist, are only going to have the potential to persist in the environment if you're continuing to apply the selective pressure of the herbicide. Meaning that in that particular environment, is it going to outcompete nature's own weeds that are existing already? No, not unless you universally apply that particular herbicide across the planet. In terms of the analogy to virus and that DNA and everything like that, a virus has specific activity based on the type that encodes genes that allow it to infect cells. This kind of DNA is freestanding. It is not infective. It does not spread throughout crops that way. It does not spread throughout humans that way.
We can manipulate its environment such that a virus can totally manipulate the receptor.
Well, in terms of virus analogy, one thing that may be a concern is that by using monoculture crops, meaning that you plant the same exact species, the same exact strain of a plant across large fields, what happens, right? You have disease occur. So that's a general problem with commercial agriculture, however, as opposed to something specific to genetically modified foods.
Yeah, so in terms of that, the way that, so it's kind of an evolution type standpoint, right? So whenever you have an organism that is genetically engineered to have some type of fitness advantage, meaning it's better able to survive than other plants, per se, in that environment. the only, like if per se we have like a drought tolerant plant, it's really only gonna have a fitness effect if there's an area where drought is substantial, right? So I think, again, like you said, it's really environment dependent as to if that's really a problem. But a lot of the traits that we're putting into these GMOs are traits that are quite beneficial for any plant to have, right? So things like drought resistant, like increased nutritional value, like resistance to using less water, to herbicides, insecticides. So it really only becomes a problem if you continuously apply that same herbicide that it's resistant to, or that same insecticide. But if you were to say, if it gets used to that same herbicide or same insecticide, if you use a different one, then you might see different results, right? So it kind of depends on how, over time, just constant exposure to a certain stimuli.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah.
How do some GMOs help the user?
Oh, good, because, yeah, we just answered that other one too. So some GMOs might be able to, so in this case, maybe not necessarily plants, but I mean plants as well. So certain organisms might be able to be designed so that they increase the nutrient content in the soil. So one particular case of that is bacteria that naturally help plants grow. So if we're able to find that bacteria and design it such that it actually helps plants grow, then that's one way that it could help the ecosystem in general. Although for those kinds of questions, I would say that we do rely more on looking at the natural diversity of organisms present and say, okay, so for instance, crop rotation. So crop rotation is a good idea because otherwise if you plant the same crop over and over again, it uses the same nutrients from the soil. But if you switch to a different crop, then that actually sometimes restores that soil to a better nutrient content in particular components. So that's something I haven't seen too much being done through genetic modification and more through natural genetic diversity of organisms.
Yeah.
Could you genetically modify people the same way we can modify plants or animals?
That is a huge no. Because there's a lot of, I think the main reason because of that is there's a lot of ethical criticisms that surround many genetically modified humans. In terms of, humans are extremely complex, so whenever you want to insert a gene, there's so many things and how genes are regulated and things like that we still don't understand. That it's really, really hard to know what is going to happen when you insert a gene into a different background that it's not used to, right? So if the process of just having to go through the clinical trials and things like that to see what a gene would do if it was inserted to a humans, would you want to be someone who's like, let me insert this and we'll see if it has a bad effect or not? There's a lot of, the government just will not allow researchers to do things like that, just put humans in potential danger that would potentially cause either harmful or kill them, harmful effects or kill them.
So, and that's, you know, again, there's kind of 2 points. So one is that we don't know the rules of the system again. So testing in humans is also a moral and ethical dilemma, right? So ethically or morally, it may not be appropriate to do tests that we don't fully understand or that we can't fully predict the outcomes for. And so those kinds of things would prevent the research from being done before we would get to the point of whether or not we determine that we can actually do it from a scientific or research perspective.
How can genetically modified foods affect us in the future? What could be the potential impact?
Right, so like I said earlier, a lot of the genetic modifications that we make to foods actually help to increase crop yields. So in the future, what this means is that it's a way for us to create a sustainable way to be able to create enough food to make sure that we are able to feed our growing population of humans. So our population is expanding and rising really, really rapidly, and we need to make sure that we have enough food to feed everyone in this world. So I feel like that is one of the main goals for genetically modifying crops.
Yeah. So earlier I mentioned that you could like modify food to make it have more nutrition. So there was a strain of rice that was modified to have more, to allow more vitamins to be produced in the bodies of the people that consume it. And it was introduced to a population in, where was it, India? it was in like a Pacific island, I think, and the population rejected the crop that was modified, even though it was proven to be safe and confer a health benefit. So one of the impacts of that would have been like improving people's health and saving them money.
So in that case, does everybody here like carrots? No? No? It's okay if you don't. So carrots are well known for having a certain vitamin in them, right? Do you know what vitamin that is? Or if you eat carrots, that's supposed to be good for what part of your body? Nice. Yes? Beta carotene. Excellent answer. Vitamin A. So beta carotene is converted into vitamin A in the body, right? So in some of these island Pacific, Pacific Island regions, they don't have carrots to eat, and they don't have things that are rich in vitamin A to help with their eyesight. So they actually have deficiencies there. So there are nutritional deficiencies in those populations. So one way that scientists came up with to help with that was to create a genetically modified version of rice that synthesized a lot of vitamin A, because rice is consumed there as a staple food product. So you can't introduce a new food product into an area because they may not be able to grow it, they may not like it may not be culturally accepted. So in this case, it was a really good fit, both in terms of the nutritional deficiencies that were happening in the area, but also being able to do it in a food product that was natural to that location. But this is an example of where it was not rejected based on safety. It was not rejected based on its efficacy. So it was actually shown to give vitamin A to your body when you ate it. The problem was that people had a natural fear of that particular product, and so they chose not to use it. And what that equated to was a lot of people, actually a lot of, in this case, children dying because of vitamin A deficiencies in that area. So I think this is a huge area for GMOs to have potential impact on health, but where concerns about GMO status and safety has prevented that from making a real impact.
Why shouldn't we label genetically modified foods if they're safe? What is the argument against label?
So kind of, again, spawning off of what he said. So a lot of people think that genetically modified organisms, no matter how many times you prove they're safe, that because it is unnatural and you're modifying its DNA, that it can be harmful. And so just that fear and I think lack of knowledge of a lot of people in the public about just how safe genetically modified organisms are or can be, if you were to label that, I feel like a lot of people, there'd be a lot of public boycotts and a lot of unrest and things like that would happen that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. About 90% of all of the crops actually grown in the U.S. are genetically modified, so the chance of you actually eating a genetically modified food every single day is quite high. You probably actually do eat genetically modified foods every single day. If you have cereal, if you have bread, if you have anything, things like that. But yeah, a lot of it is that people are just really afraid of eating something that isn't quote unquote natural or like it's supposed to be, I guess.
And so this is a good point. So yes, so especially for soy, the numbers can get up to 90% of all soy in the U.S. is genetically modified. And so soy, ingredients are in a lot of different foods, like she mentioned. So you can get a lot of exposure to GMOs. And the thing is, we, as a population in the U.S., have been consuming GMO products since about 1950. And what that means is, in terms of safety, you can't always do direct tests in humans. But what you can do is you can look at two different subsets of the population, one that consumes GMO products and one that doesn't. And then you can compare whether or not one of those populations is more predisposed to developing some sort of disease or condition. And so that's something that there is a lot of data for. So like we talked about before, testing in humans isn't always ethically or morally okay. But in this case, for some of the products that have been well established from a safety perspective, they have been fed to the U.S. population for a long time. And not only did the initial safety evaluations suggest that they are safe, but then the data of actually human consumption of those in the U.S. has proven their safety as well. So the argument against labeling would be that even people who understand that GMOs are safe and who have been very okay with eating GMOs for the past 50 years would likely start to avoid GMO products based on the label because of that natural fear. So they may go against their better intuition and actually avoid GMO products for no reason whatsoever. And that actually might, like we talked about, if those GMO products have higher yield or better nutrition, that might actually be worse for the environment if all crops have to be grown in a way that's actually more detrimental to the environment.
Can you repeat that?
So, for instance, if a GMO product or a food product is made with GMOs that are drought resistant or require less fertilizer or require less pesticide, if consumers are naturally afraid of that and choose not to purchase that product, then that means that it's going to encourage planting food products that don't have drought resistance, that require more fertilizer, that require more pesticide in order to fill that gap. So that actually, people avoiding GMOs for the wrong reasons could actually be detrimental. And like we talked about with the beta carotene, the golden rice, I would argue that that's very detrimental for those children who have vitamin A deficiencies. And so that's the kind, and labeling would make that a very concrete thing.
Do you believe that genetically modified food should be labeled?
So I have, my idea is that the FDA and the USDA should regulate labeling of GMO-free foods. So they should create a particular regulatory stance on saying, on companies being able to claim that the product is GMO-free. That means that consumers that wish to consume GMO-free products have that option when they go to the grocery store. And unlike the word natural, which has no regulatory definition, meaning that pretty much anybody can claim something as natural, versus organic. So organic is a very strict word that's applied to food products. The FDA has very strict regulations on that particular label. I would say that the same should be done for GMO-free foods. So that way, that gives consumers a choice of avoiding GMOs if they so choose, and then it's actually substantiated by the FDA that it has to meet certain specifications in order to make that claim.
This is similar to the way that like foods can market themselves as being like low fat or low calorie, if they choose to, as a benefit to like marketing the food, but they're not like required to say that they're like a high calorie or high fat food. So the same thing would be being done with GMOs. It would provide a marketing advantage to foods that don't include GMOs, but it would also give the consumer more information to make a decision about what they're consuming.
Do you have anything else to add?
Does anybody else have any questions?
I was gonna say, yeah, do we wanna open it up? So raise your hand if you have a question for them that you would like answered. Right. Well, like a question for them, like about what we've been talking about. Yeah, if you have a question. Okay, Grace, do you wanna start out?
Yeah. Last year, I read an article about, I forgot what it was called, but it was where parents could choose the eye colors and hair colors of their children by changing the genes at the end. At least that's what I read. But you said we can't do that to humans.
So there's, in terms of, that's a really hard question. So there's a lot more research that's kind of going, there's a lot of research that's going into early human development and how, and a lot of early testing for, in terms of if an embryo is pre-diagnosed to have some type of really bad genetic related disease or heritable disease that could lead them to have a really horrible life. And so there's been this speculation that parents, when they go to clinics, they can actually, if they are getting, this is only true if you're getting in vitro fertilization, right? So this is for couples where your mom actually has to donate her eggs and your father has to donate the sperm, and they actually have to fertilize that egg before it goes into the mom for that to happen. It's not really that common, but there's a lot of ethical issues where it's to, one, do you really want to genetically manipulate an egg just for a certain hair color, or is it safe? So there actually hasn't been any, I don't think there's actually been any cases where like parents have actually been able to legally change the hair color or abort a baby because of eye color differences and things like that. But there's a way for people to test to see what hair color they might have or what eye color they might have before the baby is put into the mom to become, to go to term. But, yeah.
And there's technology suggesting that we have the capability to do that, but like she said, a lot of the problem with that is that we don't necessarily know some of the unintended consequences of doing something like that. So we can dream about doing it. We have the tools to do it, per se, but there's so much unknown that's involved that the ethical and moral dilemma really prevents any sort of movement in genetic engineering treatments. But if there was going to be something in that direction, it would more likely be focused on correction of disease as opposed to picking particular traits.
Right. So a lot of times in that case, when parents are hoping to have a baby, like and you're able to test to see, will my child have Down syndrome, or will my child have some type of spina bifida or things like that. So there are ways to test for that before the egg is implanted into the mom, and so I think that's kind of where that might come into play, where if the parent wanted a blonde-haired child and they had, 4 eggs to choose from, they could potentially choose what egg they wanted the mom to have put in her belly. But other than that, there's been no actual cases where we've been able to actually go into an egg and say, okay, we're going to change your gene to be the brown hair color instead of the blonde hair color. We can't actually manipulate or insert anything into the DNA of humans as of now, legally. But there are ways where if someone wanted to, if there was a couple per se that was pre-diagnosed to have children that were autistic or that had some really type of deadly disease, there was like MS or things like that. There are ways to screen for those embryos before they're put into the mom so that they have a healthy baby that's not sick. But I think in terms of actually direct manipulations of the human genome, that in live humans we can't do that.
Can you genetically modify someone somewhere else besides in America? Like go to somewhere in Asia or South America?
No. Humans in general, there's absolutely no, we can't. Is that?
They may have looser restrictions in terms of experimentation, but ethically, I think that would be met with a lot of resistance from the entire scientific and international community. So I doubt that anyone would be so bold to try it and tell anyone about it.
Though I will say or add, there's been a lot of, in terms of actually using your genome to improve human treatment of diseases. Now that we actually have whole genome sequencing, there's been cases where we can actually say where if you have this version of the gene, you're likely to have heart disease, or if you have this version of the gene, it leads to cancer. So we're actually using information from the human genome to better develop new medicines and new drugs that are specific to the type of gene that people have. So we call it personalized medicine based on your actual genome, which is really cool. So that's a really nice new development that we've been able to use in humans, using our genetic information to better inform treatment and things like that. I will just add that.
All right, Sydney?
Are there specific farms that they call it
Are there specific? So her question was are there specific farms or locations that are good for GMO testing? Right.
So in that case, I would say, again, the more isolated, the better. So if you have a testing facility where you can keep it contained from a physical perspective, then yes, that would be the case. That would be more desirable. And that's one thing that's actually done in Europe. So they do a little bit of GMO testing in Europe too. Like I talked about, there's a big center in France where they work on some GMOs, and they keep those crops contained within the building. Yes.
Okay, so her question was, do organic foods have GMOs in them or not? Right?
They're not technically allowed to have GMO foods. within them. So organic has a very strict definition in terms of how the food product is processed over time and what goes into it from ingredients, so how it's grown and everything like that. And I don't believe that organics are allowed to contain GMO products. Yes?
So, red shirt.
So you can kind of look at it like a product that's derived from a GMO. Well, the sheep itself isn't GMO, right? But so it ate a particular GMO plant. I wouldn't classify that wool as being a GMO product, because the wool itself, the cotton itself, has its own genome. It's not been affected by the genetic manipulation. And like she had talked about before, simply eating that GMO product doesn't necessarily change anything about the sheep itself.
So a lot of the livestock and a lot of the farm animals that you see today, they actually eat a lot of GMO grains and things like that. But there's been studies that have shown that just eating GMOs, there's been nothing showing that the GMOs actually get incorporated into your DNA or any bacterial species that's living into your body with it actually being expressed. So in that case, the GMOs in the food are only really working in that food itself to better help it survive. But then once you eat it and break it down, that benefit is kind of gone, right? It just becomes nutrition for your body. So just eating a GMO food doesn't mean that GMOs are being incorporated into your body at all. It's actually being broken down. That DNA that's in that plant is being broken down around with the other DNA in that plant.
Jenna?
Yes. So a lot of the genetically modified organisms actually have genes inserted into them that are from different organisms altogether. So there's a lot of examples where I actually have written some of them down because I knew that would be a good question. So when we've been talking about golden rice, it actually was made from 3 different genes, 2 of them from a wild daffodil and 1 from a bacteria species to help it produce more vitamin A. And a lot of plants, so for those that are insecticide resistant, they actually have a gene inserted into them that is present in a naturally occurring bacteria. So what happens is they're able to produce this protein that's toxic to insects that eat it. So that's pretty cool. In cotton, we have genes from other plant species. In salmon, we had genes from a different type of salmon, plus also different types of ocean fish. So all these genes that they're inserting into these plants are being inserted because they're not there occurring naturally, right? So they occur in some other species to give them an advantage, and they're being put in. So a lot of those genes that you're seeing actually put in to confer those different traits that you want are from they can be either from really closely or very similar related species, or extremely like off the wall distantly related species.
You guys in the black vest, you had your hand up for a moment.
If a person has a disease, could you inject some like plant with healing remedy into like it's native, then if the person continues eating that, could it cure the disease?
I think that's more so you're talking about like a medicine. I don't necessarily know that putting making a food a drug in a way is necessarily been done, or
It's yes and no. So some of the way that vaccines are made are to take a particular signature part of that bacteria and have it encoded by another bacteria that's safer, so that your body can fight it off, but it gets accustomed to fighting that particular bacteria, even though it didn't see it. So that's one way that genetic modification of an organism can kind of, I don't know about curing diseases at this point, but at least in terms of vaccines, that's preventing disease.
sure.
Dominic? It's good.
Can you speak louder?
I think yes. Is there a particular type of DNA that you can?
Amount.
A certain amount? Amount.
I don't really think we quantify DNA in terms of amounts, because when you think about the cell, your cell just only has 1 copy of your entire DNA that's in your body, right? So when we insert genes into organisms, we're hoping that just one copy of that gene gets inserted into each cell, right? So, because in that case, we limit it probably to not a certain amount of DNA, but just making sure that one gene that we're interested in gets incorporated into one entire complement strand of DNA.
But, and then the more genes that you try to introduce into an organism, the more difficult it's going to be to predict the outcome. And so a lot of the products that are currently in place are only a few genes, so it's not very much for the time being. Again, because of the complexity, you add more moving parts, it gets harder to do it effectively.
Right, because when you think about adding genes into the genome, you have to think about what could happen to other genes. If you put it in the wrong place, it could disrupt the function of other genes that are in there, and things like that. So you have to be really careful with the number and actually making sure that it gets put into the right place so that it doesn't disrupt the function of other parts of the genome.
Is there a way to make a plant more powerful, like tobacco, like make a more powerful smoke?
My guess is probably yes. There is probably a way if we were to find the gene that's responsible for like nicotine development or synthesis. You could probably like boost it in some way. I mean, there's always ways that you could probably make things better, but we just have to identify what that gene is first, confidently, and then you can probably start manipulating it. But I would say it's probably possible. It hasn't been done, I don't think, but
It's possible, but there's other ways to do it, right? So one of the things you could do is you could take a look at a number of different tobacco species and say, okay, which one of these synthesizes the highest amount of nicotine? So again, that's kind of, there's two approaches here. One is that you take advantage of natural genetic diversity that's already in place, and you go out and you look for the characteristic that you want. And so that's maybe why wheat, for instance, hasn't been genetically modified yet, because we've been able to successfully look at the natural genetic diversity and take advantage of that being there. So in certain cases, it may not even be necessary to genetically modify.
So you're basically breeding them.
right, so exactly, you go out into a trade, you find, it's just like dog breeding, right? So, okay, you have this small dog that has a brown coat, and then you have this really big tall dog that just has a really great personality. So you want a brown dog with a really great personality, so you mate them together and you get the best of both worlds, right? So a lot of genetic studies actually take advantage. If you go out in the field and you find, like, the way we found drought resistance is we've screened a ton of plants, looked for the one that actually had a resistance to drought, found what the gene was, and tried to clone it. But another way to do that is you find that plant that has drought resistant and you just continuously breed it with other plants so that eventually you get a lot of other plants, or you're creating a lot of plants that also have that drought resistant gene. So you can do it naturally.
I think a major difference between the two is that when you mate plants, breed plants or animals, that's a natural genetic exchange. It's considered natural. But what actually happens is there are hundreds or thousands of different changes going on at a given time. But changes aren't necessarily a bad thing in those cases, right? So that can contribute to genetic diversity, which is actually good for a population. So the more genetic diversity you have in a natural setting, the better. In the case of genetic modification of plants or animals, you're making one very specific change, oftentimes. So the difference is that you can be very specific and very strategic about it, whereas with natural breeding, oftentimes you have to try and, like she said, look for a particular gene that has a trait that you want, and then do multiple rounds of breeding in order to make sure that that's stably genetically inherited.
Questions? Jerry?
So if animal was genetically modified, would the same modification be passed on to its offspring?
Yes. So in this case, whenever you have to genetically modify an animal, you have to do it at the egg stage in order for it to be expressed in the entire animal. So in that case, if you have to do it in the egg, it's going to be passed on through their gametes that they create. So whenever you create a genetically modified animal, it will be passed on to their offspring.
Can you put the drought in like a human so that they can last without water?
So this is where it comes back to whether or not a particular background reacts the same way. And in this case, the ways that humans survive without water are very different than the ways that plants survive without water. So taking one gene that acts that way in a different organism putting it into humans doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to behave the same way, because fundamentally plants are very different from humans. They have very different biological processes. So it doesn't always work that way. In some cases, yes. So in some cases, you can take an enzyme or a component of a cell that makes a particular thing like vitamin A, which is the case with the golden rice, and it will make vitamin A in a different background. But that's between, again, two of those genes were from plants to plants. You know, going from plants to humans is a way different story. Yes? Honeybees? Actually, were there genetic modification of honeybees?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. I know there's been a lot of conservation issues surrounding honeybees nowadays, so honeybees are kind of like a hot topic now in terms of trying to protect them and preserve them. But I don't necessarily know that there's actually been genetic manipulation of honeybees, per se.
And that's one point that we didn't make before, but one of the benefits of genetic modification would also potentially be to save species that are going extinct or are endangered. But that hasn't been done because we don't know the ramifications of that in the putting that out in the environment yet.
So we haven't done genetic modification, but they have looked at most species of bee are actually solitary. They actually don't build hives, so honeybees are fairly unique in that manner. And since they're the really important species, we have looked at potentially like crossbreeding them with solitary bees, or even trying to see if we can create like solitary bees, but we haven't taken it as far as genetic modification. At this point, it's all like in the ideas of, I wonder if we crossbred, or I wonder if this is even possible. So it's a thought, but we haven't gotten even close to this stage yet.
So you know you have an awesome teacher when she can answer a question that extra time didn't.
Yeah, so I got a good question. Number one, has NASA hopped on studying GMOs like the International Space Station, different environments? Because my personal belief is, although I personally believe what I've seen, that GMOs in not the contained environment, like you said, which is definitely key, definitely clutch. But if GMOs were to be out in the open source in fields against other crops that are of Mother Earth, let's just say like that, it's not contained. However, they could possibly play a role in our travel to Mars. Also, they talk about potentially terraforming it, which GMOs definitely play a role in, and with the long space travel, having food up there. Yeah, exactly.
That's a great point. And actually, there is some research. I'm not sure about NASA looking into that specifically, but some research at NC State is actually going in that direction.
Really?
To take genes that are related to stress, again, maybe the stresses that you experience either during space travel in transit or at on Mars, and trying to see if they can make plants that would be better suited for that kind of journey. So that's something that's actually ongoing. I forgot if NASA was the one that funded that research at NC State or not. So, but that's definitely something that's
Yeah.
Remember how I told you every branch of science is also every other branch of science? That's a great example.
Another question? Yeah.
If we were to have a species of plant that was dying out, could we possibly clone it so that we would have more of it?
Yes, and that's what we kind of talk about with conservation. The problem is, I mean, well, with cloning that might be okay because you're copying it.
Yeah.
But so that's not so much genetic modification as it is simply preserving that exact same genetic structure.
Right. So a lot of times when we think about conservation, in terms of nowadays when we face a climate that has an unpredictable environment, right? So a species that has a large amount of genetic diversity, meaning that they're not all the same, it's more likely to survive if the environment changes in the future. So there's been some controversy now as to, well, if we have species that are really endangered or on the verge of going extinct, is it beneficial for us to actually genetically engineer them so that they have more diverse genomes? Just for the sake of inserting different copies or types of genes, so that in the future, if they do face different environments, they'd be able to survive. And as of right now, none of that is feasible. There's a lot of really ethical concerns about that. So right now, in terms of conservation, pretty much what's being done is you try to keep preserving. A lot of them are like in zoos or in really protected areas and things like that, where governments will look at species or places on Earth where there's a lot of endangered or extinct species, and they'll place restrictions on them to help, to prevent like hunting or to encourage breeding efforts to help keep sustaining the population. So there hasn't, in terms of genetically engineering animals for the purpose of conservation solely, I don't think it's going to be anything per se in the next, like, in the near future. But I think as of right now, in terms of preserving them, it's predominantly breeding efforts and making sure that we keep sustaining that population somehow in a really protected and controlled environment so that they're able to survive.
This is another one I can actually jump in on. So my kids, we have our Amazing Animal of the Week where I showed you some of the animals I worked with. Last week we talked about white cheek gibbons and I showed you Tunyon. And talked about how she was actually transferred to the National Zoo in DC while I was working with her, and that let her find a mate. Building that genetic diversity is a lot of what those zoos are doing. So if I haven't mentioned before, zoos have what's called a stud book that contains all of the genetic information for like every animal of that species in the wild. So Animal Kingdom actually held the stud book for wildebeest. So like the guys that trampled Mufasa in The Lion King, right? Wildebeest. So the wildebeest stud book is about this big. So all of the like genetic information and everything for all of those wildebeest is contained within that. And preserving genetic diversity through conservation right now is happening a lot in zoos by using that stud book to find strong genetic matches. So it's, yeah. Yay, zoos.
Awesome questions, and a lot of them.
Any more? Yes?
Can you take like a gene from like a plant or an animal and put it into like a virus?
I don't know about viruses, but you can, I think, in bacteria, right? Because we use a lot of times when we do studies in genetics, we use bacteria as what we call vectors, so ways to actually get genes into the organisms. But I've never heard of it about viruses.
It's definitely possible to do, but whether or not it has any
Right.
use outside of the laboratory is probably not the case.
Yeah.
Yep. Do you have a question? Yeah, to kind of correct that. Yes, there's a whole field of study for correction.
In terms of, are you talking about like passing a gene from one person to another to correct it? I don't think that's the case. No, you can't really take a gene from someone and just put it to somebody else unless you actually like mate with that person and create a baby and hope that the good copy of that gene is like dominant and will actually be expressed in the baby. But there's no way to actually take a gene from one person and give it to someone else. Like you're giving an organ transplant. We can't actually do that.
Because once you're fully developed, like she said, after early developmental stages, your genome stays the same.
Right.
So introducing changes,
Has to happen at a young stage.
right, so you can't do that after that very short period of time.
There is work being done though. We have genomic technologies that are actually really cool. Like I mentioned before, where you can actually go in and design these proteins to cut your genome at precise locations. And you can actually insert pieces of DNA that will have like the correct or working form of a gene and get rid of the bad form of a gene and to correct diseases. So there's been cases where they've done this in just like human cell lines that we can research on for muscular dystrophy and shown that they can actually restore expression or restore the function of the gene that doesn't work in people that do have muscular dystrophy. But in terms of that actually happening in human patients and things like that, that still hasn't happened. But there is actually work moving towards trying to correct bad genes in your genome, if that's the case for humans.
And that's a very new and exciting
hugely
development.
new.
That was I think earlier this year.
Yeah,
Talking about
that was-
CRISPR-Cas.
Yes, CRISPR.
Some new technologies that have recently come about are opening doors in terms of the new genetic technology that allows us to do a lot more, like you talked about, correcting bad genes, for instance. Yes. Anything. The geneticist toolkit has vastly expanded.
Are we good? All right. So everybody say a great big thank you to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. All right.